I never thought buying an old farmhouse would lead me into a war with my HOA president Karen. I had grown tired of the cookie-cutter houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and endless rules that felt more like chains than guidance. I wanted something real, something with character, something with history. That's when I stumbled upon a listing for a 120-year-old farmhouse just outside the nearest town, far beyond the reach of any HOA authority. It was love at first sight, even though the house looked like it had survived 100 storms and a few wars. Peeling paint, sagging porches, and a roof that probably had seen better decades all whispered a story I wanted to hear. The moment I stepped onto the property, I could feel it, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones, a stillness that makes you feel like you're stepping back in time. The garden was overgrown, tall weeds swaying in the wind as if the land itself was shrugging at my presence. The old barn leaned slightly to one side, the wood darkened by age, but there was something charming about it. I half expected to see ghosts of farmers long gone peeking through the windows, or at least some raccoons glaring at me like tiny landlords of the property. Inside the house, the air smelled like a mix of aged wood, dust, and old memories. Floorboards creaked under every step, and I caught myself imagining every family that had lived here before me. The living room had a fireplace, blackened with soot from decades of winter fires, and I could almost picture children huddled around it, listening to stories their parents told. The kitchen was small but had a rustic charm, with cabinets that had survived longer than I had, and a sink that probably saw more dishes than anyone alive could remember. It wasn't perfect, not by any modern standard, but it was alive. And it was mine, or so I thought. The first day exploring the farmhouse was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. In the attic, I found old trunks filled with letters and photographs, black and white memories of people who once called this place home. A few of the letters were love notes, others were bills or requests, tiny fragments of lives lived long ago. I laughed when I saw a pair of worn-out shoes left in the corner, imagining a farmer sneaking them off after a long day, completely unaware that a century later, I would be wandering through the same spot. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, fields that had once been plowed and orchards that had long since gone wild. I could almost hear the echoes of horses, the rumble of carts, the distant chatter of neighbors. The raccoons, if they were still around, didn't seem too thrilled with my intrusion, but I took it as a good sign. They were staking their claim just like anyone else. By the end of the first day, I had made a promise to myself. I would restore this farmhouse brick by brick, board by board. I would honor its history while giving it a new life. I imagined long mornings sipping coffee on the porch, afternoons tending a garden, evenings curled up in front of that old fireplace, finally at peace. It was going to be my escape, my dream, my quiet little rebellion against a world obsessed with sameness. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with gold and purple, a letter arrived in the mailbox. I didn't recognize the name at first. It was from someone named Karen. The envelope was thick, official-looking, almost intimidating, but at first I thought it was a mistake, a misdelivered piece of junk mail. I opened it and read a few lines. Her words were polite, almost too polite, but underneath was a subtle warning. Something about rules, guidelines, and her interest in my property. I laughed nervously and tossed it aside. Surely she was mistaken. After all, my property was outside any HOA jurisdiction. She had no authority here. Right. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first spark in what would become a long and unexpected battle. A battle that would pit me against a woman obsessed with control, rules, and her imagined authority over a house that had stood long before either of us existed. I thought I was just buying a farmhouse. I had no idea I was stepping onto a stage where history, stubbornness, and ego would collide in ways I could never predict. The farmhouse waited patiently, silent and worn, as if it already knew the drama that was about to unfold. And I, full of hope and a little naivety, was ready to take the first step into what would become the most chaotic and surprisingly humorous adventure of my life. I woke up the next morning with a mix of excitement and determination. The farmhouse wasn't going to restore itself, and I had big plans. First on the agenda was the garden, or what was left of it. Tall weeds reached above my waist, tangled vines had claimed the porch, and the old fruit trees were more dead than alive. It was a mess, but I saw it differently. To me, it was a blank canvas, waiting for someone who didn't mind a little dirt under their nails. As I started clearing the weeds, I realized just how wild the property had become. The barn, which had seemed quaint from a distance, now looked like a fortress for every raccoon, stray cat, and mysterious critter within a 10-mile radius. I joked out loud, "I didn't buy a farmhouse, I bought a wildlife sanctuary." By the end of the morning, I was scratched, bitten by thorns, and covered in dirt from head to toe. I probably looked ridiculous, but I felt alive. Inside the house, the work was even more daunting. The floors were warped, the walls were cracked, and dust coated every surface like a thick blanket. I started in the kitchen, removing broken shelves, cleaning decades of grime, and trying not to be overwhelmed by the smell of old wood and musty air. I found odd things along the way, an old teapot with a chip, a faded photograph of a family I couldn't identify, and even a mouse hole or two. I laughed at the absurdity of it all. At one point, I swear a raccoon peeked in through the broken window just to judge my progress. Neighbors began to take notice. One elderly man stopped by with a curious smile. "You're brave," he said, shaking his head at the overgrown yard. "Or crazy, hard to tell which." We laughed, and he offered advice on which trees were worth saving and which would have to go. Another neighbor brought over a box of old tools, saying they might help. It felt good, a reminder that even outside the reach of the HOA, people cared about their community. But just as things were starting to feel hopeful, the memory of Corinne's letter crept back into my mind. I had tried to shrug it off, thinking it was a mistake, but the unease lingered. That evening, as I scrubbed the floorboards, I found another envelope slipped under the door. My stomach sank a little. The handwriting was sharp, precise, and unmistakably hers. She mentioned rules again, vaguely threatening consequences if I failed to comply. I read the words twice, then laughed nervously, muttering, "Okay, Corinne, game on, I guess." The next few days were a blur of work. I patched holes, sanded floors, and started painting walls in colors that felt warm and welcoming. I repaired broken furniture, refurbished old windows, and even planted a small vegetable garden in what had once been the backyard. Slowly, the farmhouse began to show signs of life again. Sunlight spilled through the cleaned windows, and the rooms, once dark and forgotten, started to feel like a home. There were moments of frustration, too. A section of the porch collapsed while I tried to fix it, sending me sprawling into the dirt. A swarm of bees decided to investigate my head for unknown reasons, and more than once I had to chase raccoons away from my carefully restored garden beds. I started joking that the animals were all part of Corinne's spying network, watching my every move and reporting back. It helped keep my spirits up, even when the work seemed endless. Despite the labor and chaos, something magical was happening. The farmhouse slowly transformed from a crumbling relic into a place that radiated character, history, and life. The air felt fresher, the walls seemed warmer, and even the raccoons seemed to respect my presence, most of the time. I began to dream of weekends spent on the porch, evenings by the fireplace, and summers tending the orchard. It was hard work, but every splinter, bruise, and stain reminded me that this was mine, a piece of history I could honor and preserve. But the shadow of Corinne loomed. The letters, the tone, and the subtle threats reminded me that peace might be fleeting. I had thought the hardest part would be the restoration itself, but now I understood that the real challenge wasn't just fixing the farmhouse. It was keeping it. I didn't know it yet, but Corinne had already started plotting her next move, and her obsession was about to escalate in ways I could never have imagined. That night, as I stood on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a mixture of pride and unease. The farmhouse was slowly becoming the home I had dreamed of, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Corinne was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The real battle was just beginning, and I had no idea how dramatic, ridiculous, and exhausting it would soon become. It was a warm Saturday morning when I first saw Corinne in person. I had been tending to the garden, trimming branches and pulling weeds when a bright red car screeched down the driveway. She stepped out, impeccably dressed, clipboard in hand, and a look of determined authority on her face. I stopped mid-swing, staring at her like she had just appeared out of a nightmare. "Hello," she said, voice saccharine sweet, but with an edge that made me instantly tense. "I'm Corinne. I just wanted to check on your property and make sure everything is up to standard." I blinked, Standard for what? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but my heart was starting to race. She smiled tightly and handed me a stack of papers. HOA rules, property guidelines, things everyone should follow. I laughed nervously. You do realize I'm outside the HOA, right? Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it tightened. Oh, I'm aware, but rules are rules, and neighbors care. I stared at her for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or scream. Here was a woman insisting she had authority over a property that wasn't even in her jurisdiction. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I decided to play it cool. Well, then I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree, I said, handing back the papers. Karen didn't leave. She started walking around the property, pointing out things I hadn't even noticed. That fence is uneven. Those weeds are unacceptable. Your chickens are far too loud for the neighborhood. I tried to contain my laughter. My chickens were busy pecking at the ground, completely ignoring her. I whispered under my breath, I think they agree with me. Her inspection continued for what felt like hours. She measured the height of the grass, muttered about property lines that were already decades old, and even attempted to take photos of my farmhouse for reasons I couldn't comprehend. At one point, she peered into the barn and frowned. That structure is unsafe, she said. I could have someone file a report. I raised an eyebrow, or I could restore it myself. She ignored me and scribbled something down in her notebook. I could tell she was frustrated that her authority was invisible here. The humor of the situation hit me, but I also felt a creeping sense of unease. Karen was relentless and her obsession was obvious. This wasn't about rules or safety, it was about control. Neighbors had started to peek from their porches and driveways, watching the interaction. Some smiled sympathetically, others shook their heads. I noticed old Mr. Henderson, the man who had first welcomed me, giving me a thumbs up. It was comforting to know I had allies, even if they weren't directly involved. Karen finally turned to me, her expression tight with frustration. I expect you to comply with the rules, and I'll be checking back regularly, she said. She got back into her car and drove off, leaving a trail of dust and a lingering tension that settled over the property like a shadow. I stood there staring at the dust cloud, trying to process what had just happened. I laughed, mostly at the absurdity of it. A woman who didn't even have authority over my property had just spent hours trying to assert control over my life. It was ridiculous. But then the seriousness of it hit me. Karen wasn't going to give up. This wasn't a one-time visit. This was the beginning of a prolonged and ridiculous battle. That evening, as I cleaned up my tools and tended to the garden again, I found another envelope slipped under the mailbox. Karen had already started sending more letters, reiterating her demands in increasingly pointed language. The humor I had felt earlier now mingled with tension. I realized that restoring the farmhouse wasn't just about wood and paint. It was going to be about patience, strategy, and occasionally pure stubbornness. I spent the rest of the night making a plan. I would continue restoring the farmhouse, documenting everything and keeping detailed records. If Karen thought she could intimidate me with letters and surprise inspections, she was going to learn that I was prepared. And somewhere deep down, I felt a thrill. This was turning into something far bigger than I had anticipated. It was a fight for history, for pride, and for the right to call a place like this home without interference. As I finally turned off the lights and looked out the window, the farmhouse glowed softly in the moonlight, standing tall and proud. It had survived 100 years, and now it was my turn to protect it. And Karen? Well, she was going to find out that some things, no matter how much she wanted control over them, could not be taken. The days after Karen's visit were tense. I tried to focus on restoring the farmhouse, but every time the mail arrived, my stomach sank a little. Another envelope from her would appear, always thick, always formal, and always carrying that unmistakable air of authority she believed she had. It wasn't just letters anymore. Karen's tone was growing sharper, more insistent, and I could feel the edge of obsession creeping through every line. One morning, as I sorted through the mail, I found a letter that made me pause. She had drafted an official-looking document claiming that I was in violation of neighborhood guidelines and that fines could be imposed if I failed to comply. The absurdity hit me first. The farmhouse was outside the HOA. I could practically hear the echoes of decades of history laughing at her. Then the unease settled in. Karen wasn't bluffing. She genuinely thought she could impose rules on a property that wasn't hers to control. I knew I needed advice. I called a lawyer, someone familiar with property rights and HOA disputes. After explaining the situation, he chuckled. "She's out of her mind," he said, "and out of her jurisdiction. As long as you have the property records, you're untouchable." I felt a little relief, but it was tempered by the realization that Karen wasn't the kind of person to give up easily. Later that week, I continued restoration work. I patched holes in the walls, cleaned centuries of dust, and started repairing the roof. The farmhouse was slowly transforming, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. At one point, I climbed into the attic and discovered a box of old tools and letters from previous owners. I imagined the generations that had lived here, their lives intertwined with the creaking floors and the peeling paint. It was humbling, and it strengthened my resolve. Then another envelope appeared. This one was more aggressive, with language suggesting consequences if I didn't meet the community standards. She even hinted at complaints to the county, inspections, and fines that didn't exist. I laughed out loud, shaking my head. "You can try, Karen, but the farmhouse has stood longer than either of us," I muttered to myself. The humor helped, but I knew she was escalating, and I needed to be ready. I began documenting everything. Every repair, every letter, every conversation with neighbors. I photographed the property, made notes about the timeline of restoration, and started a folder labeled Karen Correspondence. It felt a little like preparing for battle, which, in a way, it was. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was actively trying to challenge something that had been standing for over a century. The tension in the neighborhood started to build subtly. Some neighbors whispered about Karen's obsession. Others gave me knowing looks as I worked on the farmhouse. The garden was coming back to life, flowers beginning to bloom, vegetables sprouting, and the porch slowly taking shape. Yet with every sign of progress, I felt Karen's presence looming. She wasn't here physically, but her letters, her insistence, and her imagined authority made her feel omnipresent. One evening, as I was painting the front door, I imagined her standing across the street, scrutinizing every brushstroke, muttering to herself about rules that didn't exist. I chuckled at the absurdity, imagining her wearing a monocle and carrying a measuring tape everywhere she went. The humor helped, but it didn't erase the knowledge that Karen's obsession could lead to bigger problems. She was capable of more than letters. She could involve officials, neighbors, or even local media if she wanted to. I realized that protecting the farmhouse wasn't just about nails, paint, or repairs. It was about standing my ground, knowing my rights, and being prepared for anything she could throw at me. It was a battle of wills, patience, and documentation. The farmhouse had survived storms, time, and neglect. It could survive Karen too. That night I sat on the porch, exhausted from the day's work, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the earthiness of the garden. The farmhouse glowed softly under the moonlight, beautiful and defiant. And somewhere out there, Karen was writing another letter, plotting her next move. The real confrontation was just around the corner, and I knew I had to be ready. The farmhouse was more than a home. It had become a symbol of resilience. And I was ready to defend it, no matter how ridiculous the battle might get. It started as a normal morning. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmhouse and the untamed fields. I was outside, sweeping leaves off the porch and humming to myself when I noticed movement near the barn. At first, I thought it was another raccoon or maybe a stray cat. But as I squinted, I realized it was Karen. She was creeping along the property line, clipboard in hand, as if she were on a secret mission. I froze for a moment, unsure how to react. Part of me wanted to laugh, but another part of me felt my blood pressure spike. She was audacious, bold, and completely oblivious to the fact that she had no authority here. I decided to confront her before things escalated further. "Karen," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, "can I help you with something?" She jumped slightly and spun around, pretending to be startled. "Oh, I was just inspecting the area," she said, her tone way too cheerful to be believable. "Making sure everything is in order." I narrowed my eyes. Inspecting for what? She waved her clipboard vaguely. "Community standards, safety, guidelines, you know." I took a deep breath, trying to contain my laughter. "Karen, this property is outside your HOA. You have no jurisdiction here." Her smile faltered, and for a brief moment I thought she might leave. Instead, she started packing back and forth, pointing at things like a drill sergeant obsessed with invisible rules. "That fence is crooked," she said. "Those weeds are too tall. Your chickens are making noise." I tried to stay calm, but the absurdity was overwhelming. "My chickens?" I asked. "You mean the ones pecking at the dirt? Yeah, they're loud. They've been here longer than most homeowners in the neighborhood." Her frown deepened. She started taking notes aggressively, scribbling on her clipboard as if documenting every misstep would somehow give her authority. I watched her for a moment, imagining her turning into a cartoon villain, measuring everything with exaggerated precision. It was ridiculous, but I couldn't help feeling a spark of irritation mixed with humor. Then things escalated. She stepped closer to the barn, trying to open the door. I knew she had no legal right to do so, but my first instinct was to stop her before something catastrophic or comical happened. "Karen, don't touch that," I said firmly. She looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "I have to inspect it," she said, her voice trembling slightly with frustration. "For safety purposes." I walked over, keeping my tone calm but assertive. "This is private property. You are trespassing." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed shocked. Then she muttered something under her breath, glared at me, and stormed back toward the property line. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart. The encounter had been tense, but I felt victorious. She had tried, and she had failed. As she drove away, kicking up dust behind her car, I chuckled to myself. This woman was relentless, but I was starting to see the pattern. Letters, inspections, intimidation. She would try everything in her power, legal or otherwise, to assert control over something that wasn't hers. The humor of the situation helped, but I also realized the stakes were higher now. She wasn't just a nuisance. She was a persistent, calculating opponent. Later that day, I documented the incident meticulously. Photographs, notes, timestamps, everything went into a folder labeled Karen Encounters. I knew she might try to escalate further, involving county officials, neighbors, or even the media. The farmhouse wasn't just a project anymore. It was a battlefield. Despite the tension, I threw myself back into restoration. I repaired the porch, cleaned the windows, and even started repainting the barn door. Each stroke of paint felt like a small victory, a statement that the farmhouse belonged to me and me alone. The animals watched silently, and for a brief moment, I imagined the raccoons giving me an approving nod. That evening, as I sat on the porch, I reflected on the day. Karen had made her first direct attempt to interfere, and it had been ridiculous, frustrating, and exhausting. Yet the farmhouse had stood firm, unyielding. It had survived more than a century of storms, neglect, and time itself. Surely it could survive Karen. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was only the beginning. She was relentless, persistent, and probably already plotting her next move. The farmhouse had been mine to restore, but it was about to become the stage for a long, absurd, and strangely dramatic showdown. And I was ready to fight, both for the property and for the peace that came with claiming a piece of history as my own. After Karen's first direct attempt, I thought things might settle down. I was wrong. The very next week, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was thicker, more official-looking, and carried a sense of menace I hadn't felt before. She had escalated, now attempting to involve the county, claiming that my property somehow violated zoning rules and community standards. I laughed nervously. The farmhouse was legally mine outside her HOA, but Karen didn't seem to care about legality. She cared about control. I called my lawyer again, explaining the situation. He sighed, half amused and half exasperated. "She's really committed to this, isn't she?" he asked. "The good news is everything you're doing is completely legal. The letters are empty threats. The county can't enforce anything she's claiming." I felt a wave of relief, but I knew Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Determined to protect the farmhouse, I began documenting everything meticulously. I photographed the property, saved every letter, and even recorded conversations with neighbors who had witnessed her antics. Every time she called the county, I made a note of it. This was turning into a war of persistence, and I intended to win. And when I would need to? Karen's obsession grew more apparent by the day. She began driving by the property frequently, lingering at the edge of the driveway, muttering into her phone. One morning, I saw her pointing at the barn with a level, as if measuring it for demolition. I imagined her wearing a cape and a monocle, declaring herself the supreme ruler of the neighborhood. I laughed out loud, but underneath, I felt that familiar tension creeping in. She was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. I threw myself into restoration even more aggressively. The porch was fully repaired, the barn door repainted, and the garden was thriving. Flowers bloomed, vegetables sprouted, and the air smelled like earth and fresh paint. I worked long hours, sometimes forgetting to eat, sometimes just pausing to admire the progress. Each improvement felt like a small victory against Corinne's relentless attempts to control me. Neighbors began to comment on the contrast between Corinne's obsession and my progress. One of them joked, "She's mad because the farmhouse is alive and she can't control it." I laughed at the absurdity, but there was truth in it. Corinne thrived on order, control, and perfection. The farmhouse represented freedom, history, and life, and it was beyond her reach. Then came the day she made the mistake. She stepped onto my property again, closer than ever, and started trying to interact with the barn as if it were her own. I had my lawyer on speed dial and had prepared everything meticulously. This time, I was ready. I calmly approached her, documenting her presence with photographs and video while making it clear she was trespassing. She argued, shouted, and waved her clipboard like a weapon, but I stood my ground. She was furious, and for a moment, it felt like a standoff in an old Western movie. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, she stormed off, leaving a cloud of dust and frustration behind. I could feel my heart racing, a mixture of adrenaline, relief, and disbelief. She was relentless, but I had survived her first serious escalation. The farmhouse had stood firm. My documentation, preparation, and patience had paid off. That evening, I sat on the porch, staring at the slowly restored barn and the lights beginning to glow in the farmhouse windows. The raccoons were out, peering curiously from the edges of the garden, and I imagined they were applauding my efforts. I reflected on the absurdity of it all. A 120-year-old farmhouse, a woman obsessed with rules she couldn't enforce, and me, caught in the middle trying to reclaim peace and history. But I knew the battle wasn't over. Corinne's obsession was escalating, and she was capable of even more ridiculous and potentially destructive antics. The farmhouse had survived storms, neglect, and decades of wear. Now it would have to survive Corinne, and I was determined that it would. I poured myself another cup of coffee, smiling to myself. This wasn't just restoration anymore. It was a fight for pride, history, and the right to live without interference. The real showdown was coming, and I was ready. The confrontation finally arrived one sunny afternoon. I had been working on the farmhouse all morning, sanding the windows and repainting the trim, when I saw Corinne's bright red car screech to a halt at the edge of the property. She stepped out, more determined than ever, clutching her clipboard like a shield. I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment when all the letters, threats, and ridiculous attempts at authority would collide with reality. "Hello again," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I'm here to resolve some outstanding issues regarding your property." I raised an eyebrow. "Outstanding issues? Corinne, this property is mine. Everything you've claimed has no legal basis." She ignored me and began packing the yard, muttering about fences, weeds, and my chickens. I let her rant, silently counting every absurd statement. Neighbors had started to gather discreetly, curious about what was unfolding. I could see old Mr. Henderson watching from his porch, a mixture of concern and amusement on his face. I had called my lawyer earlier, and he was waiting nearby, ready to step in if necessary. I also had my documentation, photographs, letters, videos, and detailed notes about every encounter. It felt like preparing for a trial, except the courtroom was my porch and the witness stand was the front yard. "Corinne's obsession has reached a new level," I muttered to myself, smiling wryly. "I never imagined that restoring a farmhouse would come with this kind of drama." She suddenly stopped, glaring at the barn, and shouted, "This structure is unsafe. I can file a complaint right now." I stepped forward calmly, holding up a folder of documents. "Corinne's complaints have no legal weight. Here's the proof. This farmhouse is fully mine, outside your HOA, and meets all safety regulations. Everything you've claimed is baseless." Her eyes flickered over the papers, and for a brief moment I saw doubt in them. She tried to argue, to twist some imaginary rule into relevance, but every attempt fell flat against the mountain of evidence I had prepared. My lawyer stepped forward, clarifying her lack of jurisdiction, and the neighbors nodded in agreement. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment I thought she might actually storm off in defeat. Instead, she did something almost comical. She tried one last desperate tactic, attempting to intimidate me by loudly contacting the county officials over her cell phone, claiming that the farmhouse was violating imaginary codes. I stood calmly, sipping my water, and watched as her efforts crumbled in real time. The officials on the other end quickly informed her that the property was legal, outside the HOA, and entirely compliant. Her face went from anger to disbelief to outright humiliation. I couldn't help but laugh quietly. This was the moment when all her threats, all her letters, and all her ridiculous antics collided with reality. The farmhouse had stood for 120 years, and Corinne's obsession wasn't going to change that. She had underestimated the power of preparation, patience, and a little stubbornness. Finally, she stormed off, muttering under her breath, leaving a trail of dust and fury. The neighbors quietly applauded, some laughing at the absurdity, others shaking their heads. I felt a mixture of relief, triumph, and exhaustion. The battle wasn't just about the farmhouse anymore. It had become about persistence, pride, and the right to live without interference. I walked around the property, inspecting the restoration work one last time that day. The barn door was newly painted, the porch sturdy, and the garden flourishing. The farmhouse glowed softly under the afternoon sun, proud and unyielding. It had survived storms, neglect, and now, a human obsession that seemed intent on control. As the sun began to set, I reflected on the absurdity and intensity of the past weeks. Corinne had tried everything, from letters to inspections, from threats to intimidation, and yet here I was, standing victorious. The farmhouse wasn't just restored, it was defended. It had survived not just the passage of time, but human obsession. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The raccoons peeked from the shadows, curious but cautious. I imagined them nodding in approval, acknowledging the triumph. The farmhouse had been tested, and it had passed. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace. The confrontation with Corinne was over, at least for now, and the farmhouse was truly mine. It wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, history, and the absurd yet satisfying reality that some things, no matter how much someone wants to control them, cannot be taken. And as night fell, the farmhouse stood quietly, strong and proud, ready to weather whatever came next. Not storms, not neglect, not even Corinne. After Corinne stormed off for the final time, I finally felt the weight of relief settle over me. The farmhouse was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. No letters, no inspections, no imaginary rules could touch it now. The porch creaked gently under my weight as I sat down, sipping coffee and letting the sun warm my shoulders. The restoration was complete, but more importantly, the farmhouse had survived the human drama that had threatened to overshadow its history. Walking through the rooms, I marveled at the transformation. The kitchen, once covered in grime and cobwebs, gleamed with polished wood and freshly painted cabinets. The living room smelled faintly of wood polish and history, with the fireplace finally ready for winter fires. Every corner, every floorboard, every nail reflected the hard work, patience, and stubbornness that had brought the farmhouse back to life. Outside, the garden was thriving. Flowers burst with color, vegetables reached toward the sky, and the orchard trees swayed gently in the breeze. Even the barn, once sagging and weathered, now stood proudly, its freshly painted door a statement of resilience. The raccoons peeked cautiously from the shadows, still curious but finally respectful of the territory. I chuckled, imagining them shaking their tiny heads in disbelief at the absurd saga that had unfolded around this old farmhouse. Neighbors stopped by more frequently, now not out of curiosity but to celebrate. One brought over freshly baked pies, joking, "We're glad the farmhouse survived Corinne's storm of nonsense." Another handed me a small plaque for the garden, inscribed with "For patience and persistence." I laughed, thinking about the sheer ridiculousness of it all, and yet feeling touched by the support. Outside the reach of the HOA, this farmhouse had become a symbol of freedom, community, and history preserved. As the weeks passed, the letters from Karen stopped. It was almost anticlimactic. I heard rumors that she had tried other tactics in the neighborhood but had been repeatedly corrected and ignored. I didn't mind. The farmhouse had endured her obsession, and it had emerged stronger, more beautiful, and full of life. The experience had been exhausting, dramatic, and absurd, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Sitting on the porch one evening, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had bought a house, restored it, and in the process had defended it against someone who thought the world revolved around their idea of control. I had learned patience, persistence, and the importance of standing my ground. The farmhouse had taught me more than any lesson in real estate or restoration ever could. I also learned the value of humor. Imagining Karen as a cartoon villain, measuring fences and muttering about imaginary rules had kept me sane during the most stressful moments. Laughter became my shield, resilience my weapon. The farmhouse wasn't just a building. It was a testament to perseverance, absurdity, and the power of believing in your own rights. As night fell, I lit the fireplace for the first time since completing the restoration. The flames danced gently, casting shadows on the walls and highlighting the history etched into every corner. The farmhouse had been a dream, a project, and a battlefield, and now it was home. I curled up with a blanket, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the faint sounds of nocturnal animals outside. The peace felt earned, hard-won, and infinitely satisfying. In the end, Karen thought she could claim a 120-year-old dream, but some things cannot be taken, no matter how much someone wants them. The farmhouse stood as a reminder that history, determination, and a little stubbornness can overcome obsession and absurdity. It wasn't just restored, it was defended, celebrated, and alive. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that the farmhouse would stand for many more years, welcoming whoever appreciated its charm, its story, and its resilience. It had survived storms, neglect, and one determined HOA president. It had survived me, and in the end, it had thrived. The farmhouse was home, and nothing could ever take that away. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.